The wind howls through the narrow corridor of the Atlas Mountains, carrying with it the acrid smell of burned rubber and diesel fuel. German panzer crews stand atop their Tiger tanks, scanning the horizon where American positions once held firm. The iron crosses painted on their turrets gleam dully in the winter sun. Below them, scattered across the rocky terrain, lie the remnants of the American Second Corps, abandoned half-tracks, overturned supply trucks, their contents spilling onto the sand like the entrails of a defeated army. The German soldiers laugh, some lighting cigarettes, others passing around a canteen of schnapps. They have just witnessed what they believe to be confirmation of everything they were taught, that the Americans are soft, undisciplined, a nation of factory workers playing at war. Oberst Rudolf Lang of the 21st Panzer Division writes in his field journal that evening, his handwriting steady despite 3 days of combat. The Americans run at the first sign of real battle. They have equipment, yes, but no spirit, no understanding of what war truly demands. Around him, his men inventory their spoils, crates of rations still warm, ammunition belts never fired, even a jeep with keys still in the ignition. One sergeant holds up an American K-ration, examining the chocolate bar inside, as if it were an archaeological artifact from a civilization too naive to survive. "Look at this," he says to no one in particular. "They bring candy to a war." But what these men cannot see, what their confidence blinds them to in this moment of triumph, is that this is not the end of something, it is the beginning. The battle that would become known as Kasserine Pass was never supposed to happen the way it did. When American forces first arrived in North Africa in November 1942 as part of Operation Torch, they came with enthusiasm that exceeded their experience. Most had never heard a shot fired in anger. Their commanders, earnest, well-trained in the theories learned at West Point and Fort Benning, had never orchestrated movements larger than battalion exercises. They faced an enemy that had been fighting since Poland, that had refined its tactics across 3 continents, that moved with the muscle memory of 4 years of mechanized warfare. The Wehrmacht officers who encountered them at Kasserine saw exactly what they expected to see: confusion, hesitation, the chaos of men learning war's grammar in real time. When Generalfeldmarschall Erwin Rommel, the Desert Fox himself, arrived to observe the American positions in mid-February 1943, he wrote to his wife Lucie with something approaching pity. "The Americans show a touching faith in their technology, but war is not won by those who arrive with the most trucks." His assessment was shared across the Wehrmacht officer corps. These were not the British, hardened by Dunkirk and the Blitz. These were not the Russians, fighting with the desperation of survival. These were Americans, citizens of a country that had known no invasion, no occupation, no true national suffering in living memory. What Rommel and his officers understood as weakness was something more complex, something that would only reveal itself in time. The American military was not built on Prussian tradition or imperial legacy. It was an improvisation, a jazz composition being written in real time, and it brought with it all the awkwardness of creation. But it also brought something else, something the Germans had no framework to recognize: the capacity for radical transformation. On February 14, 1943, when German forces launched their offensive through the Kasserine Pass, they moved with the precision of a surgical strike. The 10th and 21st Panzer Divisions, supported by Italian units, struck at the seam between American and French positions. The sound was apocalyptic, the scream of Stuka dive bombers, the percussion of 88mm guns finding their range, the metallic shriek of tank treads on stone. American forward positions, manned largely by the green troops of the 1st Armored Division, broke, Not everywhere, not all at once, but in enough places that the line collapsed like a poorly built wall.
The German tankers pursued with aggressive confidence, their Tigers and Panzer IVs overwhelming the lighter American Shermans. American soldiers, many seeing combat for the first time, retreated. Some retreated in order, falling back to secondary positions. Others retreated in panic, abandoning equipment that would later fuel German mockery. In the command posts behind the lines, American officers made the kinds of mistakes that only inexperience allows. Units sent to wrong coordinates, artillery fire landing on friendly positions, communications breaking down in the fog of battle. By February 17, German forces had pushed 12 miles through the pass. American casualties exceeded 6,000, killed, wounded, or captured. More damaging than the numbers was the psychological blow. The myth of American invincibility, carefully constructed by newsreels and propaganda, lay shattered in the Tunisian dust. When word reached Berlin, Goebbels' propaganda ministry seized on it with glee. Radio broadcasts described American soldiers throwing down their weapons and running like rabbits before the wolf. In German mess halls from Norway to Greece, officers toasted what seemed to be confirmation of Aryan superiority. The German soldiers who paused to examine the American positions they had overrun found evidence that confirmed their prejudices. The sheer quantity of material was staggering, more ammunition than they had seen in months of supply shortages. Rations that included not just bread and sausage, but fruit cocktail and coffee. Medical supplies in such abundance that one German doctor remarked it seemed like an entire hospital had been packed into each aid station. One lieutenant from the 21st Panzer wrote home, "They have everything except the one thing that matters, the will to stand and fight." But in the scattered American units that had not broken, something different was happening. In the 16th Infantry Regiment, soldiers who had survived the initial onslaught were not defeated, they were furious. Sergeants who had lost half their squads spent the night of February 17 not in despair, but in bitter analysis. What went wrong? What could be done differently? A private from Ohio, writing in a letter that would be recovered decades later, described the mood. "We got our asses handed to us, pardon the language, Ma, but I'll tell you this, it won't happen twice. We learn fast." This capacity for learning, for adaptation without the burden of tradition, was invisible to the Germans. They saw disorder where there was actually flexibility, weakness where there was actually the most dangerous thing an army can possess, the humility to change. On February 20, as German forces prepared to exploit their breakthrough, the American command structure began its transformation. Major General Lloyd Fredendall, whose confused orders and rear position command post had contributed to the disaster, was relieved. In his place came a man whose name would become synonymous with armored warfare, though at this moment he was still relatively unknown to the German intelligence officers, Lieutenant General George S. Patton, Jr. Patton arrived in Tunisia like a storm front. He wore a polished helmet, ivory-handled pistols, and an expression of barely controlled rage that made even veteran sergeants straighten their backs. His first action was not tactical, it was psychological. He instituted regulations that seemed absurd to men still carrying the trauma of defeat. Neckties would be worn at all times, even in combat zones. Helmets, not caps. Salutes, sharp and proper. Soldiers grumbled that they needed tactics, not dress codes. They did not yet understand that Patton was rebuilding their self-image from the outside in, that discipline was the armor he was fitting them with before they faced the enemy again. But Patton did more than demand spit and polish. He brought with him a tactical philosophy refined by years of study, and he implemented it with the speed of a man who understood that time was measured in lives. American artillery, which had been poorly coordinated at Kasserine, was reorganized into fire support networks that could bring concentrated hell down on any coordinate within minutes.
Tank platoons, which had been thrown piecemeal into battle, were reformed into combined arms teams that moved with infantry and engineers as single organisms. Intelligence gathering, which had been haphazard, became systematic. Reconnaissance units pushed forward constantly, feeding information back to command posts that actually knew how to use it. Most importantly, Patton changed the psychology. He visited frontline units personally, standing in exposed positions while German artillery fell, delivering speeches that were profane, brutal, and exactly what his men needed to hear. "They beat us because we fought their kind of fight," he told the 1st Infantry Division on February 23rd. "Now we're going to make them fight our kind of fight, and they're going to learn what it means to face an American who's pissed off." The transformation was not instantaneous, it was not clean, but it was thorough. When German forces probed American positions in late February, expecting to find the same confused resistance, they encountered something different. Artillery fire came down with precision that surprised even British observers. American infantry, instead of retreating, held positions with a stubbornness that forced German commanders to commit more resources than anticipated. And most tellingly, American armor began to operate not with reckless courage, but with tactical sophistication, using terrain, coordinating with infantry, withdrawing when necessary, and counterattacking when the moment was right. On March 17th, exactly 1 month after the initial German breakthrough, American forces launched Operation WAP, a counteroffensive designed to retake positions lost at Kasserine. The Germans, who had spent weeks fortifying their gains, expected another clumsy American assault. What they received was a coordinated combined arms attack that would have earned respect from any Wehrmacht instructor. American artillery saturated German positions with a volume of fire that even veterans of the Eastern Front found overwhelming. American infantry advanced behind a rolling barrage, while engineers cleared mines and tank destroyers picked off German armor from hull-down positions. The German defenders fought with their usual competence, but they found themselves facing an enemy that had learned its lessons at a speed that violated every assumption about American character. A German captain, captured during the battle, expressed bewilderment in his interrogation. "These are not the same soldiers we fought last month. They move differently. They think differently." His interrogator, an American intelligence officer, allowed himself a thin smile. "No," he replied, "we're exactly the same soldiers. We're just American, and you don't know what that means yet." What it meant was this: an army unbound by tradition was also unbound by the limitations tradition imposed. Where European militaries moved within established doctrines, adapting slowly through official channels, the American military adapted like a living organism, chaotically, sometimes wastefully, but with a speed that turned weeks into evolutionary generations. Sergeants who learned a tactic in the morning were teaching it to their squads by afternoon. Officers who discovered an effective technique were sharing it with adjacent units by nightfall. The entire force was a massive, decentralized experiment in military learning, and the laboratory was the battlefield itself. But there was another element to this transformation, one that the Germans struggled to articulate even as they encountered it. American soldiers fought differently because they came from a society that functioned differently. Every German soldier was trained to understand his place in a hierarchy, to execute orders from above, to function as part of a machine where the machine itself was more important than any individual component. This created armies of magnificent discipline and coordination, but it also created brittleness. When the machine broke, it was difficult to improvise repairs. American soldiers came from a culture of individualism verging on anarchy. They questioned orders, complained constantly, showed little respect for rank when out of combat. German observers interpreted this as lack of discipline, as weakness. What they failed to see was that this same culture produced soldiers who, when the plan fell apart, did not wait for orders to tell them what to do next. They figured it out themselves, improvised, adapted, and kept fighting.
The chaos that looked like weakness was actually a kind of resilience, a distributed intelligence that meant the army could take enormous punishment and still function. And then there was the material abundance, that endless cascade of equipment and supplies that German soldiers had mocked at Kasserine. At first, it seemed like proof of American softness, soldiers who needed chocolate bars and coffee to fight. But as the campaign continued, as German supply lines stretched and stretched again, as their tanks sat immobile for lack of spare parts and their artillery fell silent for lack of shells, the abundance revealed itself not as luxury, but a different kind of warfare altogether. The Americans were not bringing abundance because they were soft. They were bringing abundance because their entire strategic philosophy was based on overwhelming material superiority. Where German doctrine emphasized the decisive battle, the single brilliant maneuver that would shatter the enemy's will, American doctrine was building towards something different, a style of warfare based on relentless, grinding pressure supported by industrial production that could replace losses faster than the enemy could inflict them. Every destroyed Sherman was replaced by 3 more. Every expended artillery shell was matched by 100 rolling off production lines in Pennsylvania. The Germans were fighting beautifully with scarce resources. The Americans were fighting adequately with unlimited resources. And in a long war, adequacy with abundance defeats brilliance with scarcity every single time. By April 1943, as the North African campaign moved toward its conclusion, the Battle of Kasserine Pass had become something different than what either side initially believed it to be. For the Germans, it remained a tactical victory, proof that they could still defeat Allied forces in the field. But strategically, it had taught the Americans lessons they would never forget, and it had cost the Germans something more valuable than the ground they had temporarily held. It had cost them their contempt. When American forces landed in Sicily that July, German commanders prepared to face an enemy they now took seriously. When they met American armor in France, they no longer assumed that quantity of equipment could be dismissed as compensation for lack of quality. The 21st Panzer Division, which had broken through at Kasserine, would face American forces again at Normandy. The soldiers who had mocked the chocolate bars in 1943 were in full retreat by 1944, and many of them would spend the final year of the war wondering how an army they had beaten so decisively at the beginning had become the force that helped crush the Wehrmacht by the end.
The answer lay in what Kasserine represented, not America's weakness, but its greatest strength, the capacity to fail, learn, and transform. The ability to take a catastrophic defeat and metabolize it into institutional knowledge within weeks. The willingness to replace commanders who failed without the paralysis of face-saving or political consideration. The cultural foundation that produced soldiers who could question, adapt, and innovate without waiting for permission from above. In the decades after the war, military historians would analyze Kasserine Pass as a case study in American military learning. The statistics were stark. An army that suffered 6,000 casualties in 4 days of fighting had, within 6 weeks, transformed itself into a force capable of offensive operations against veteran German units. The transformation was not complete. American forces would continue to make mistakes, would continue to take unnecessary casualties throughout the war, but the trajectory had changed. Perhaps the most telling evidence came not from American sources, but from German ones. In April 1943, as Axis forces in North Africa faced inevitable defeat, a German intelligence assessment circulated among Wehrmacht commanders. It warned that while individual American soldiers might lack the training and ideological commitment of German troops, the American military system possessed a dangerous talent for self-correction and a material base that makes their mistakes temporary while ours become permanent. The assessment recommended that future planning account for an American military that would become more formidable with each engagement rather than less. It was an accurate prophecy, though by the time it was written, it was already too late for such knowledge to matter.
On the battlefield at Kasserine Pass today, the wind still howls through the mountain corridor, stirring dust that contains molecules of metal and blood and the residue of explosions 7 decades cold. Tourists occasionally visit, mostly Americans, walking terrain their grandfathers fought across. The site itself reveals little. The tanks are gone, the bodies long buried, the tactical positions erased by time and weather. What remains is harder to see, but more permanent. The lesson that a democracy's military, for all its initial chaos and confusion, possesses a quality that authoritarian forces can never quite match. It's the same quality that allowed citizen soldiers to build an army from nothing in 1917, to do it again in 1941, and transform defeat into eventual victory, not through superior tactics or individual brilliance, but through the simple, revolutionary idea that learning from mistakes is not weakness, but the foundation of all genuine strength. The Germans at Kasserine saw men who ran, equipment abandoned, positions overrun. They saw confirmation of everything they believed about democracy's soft corruption. What they could not see, what their ideology made invisible to them, was that those same men would return, harder and wiser, carrying with them not the shame of defeat, but the practical knowledge of what defeat teaches. In the end, Kasserine Pass was not about who won a single battle in February 1943. It was about which system could transform loss into learning faster than the other could transform victory into strategic advantage. And in that longer contest, the American military, chaotic, wasteful, irreverent, and absolutely relentless in its capacity to adapt, proved to be exactly what its society had designed it to be. Not perfect, but perfectible. Not invincible, but unkillable. Not the best army in the world on any given day, but the one that would keep getting better until better was enough. The chocolate bars that German soldiers mocked at Kasserine were still there at the end, still being distributed to American troops as they rolled through the ruins of the Third Reich. But by then, no one was laughing.